Did you know that there was a figure in the Bible so mysterious that the Catholics, Protestants, Mormons, Jews, and even occult mystery schools all claim him as their own? And they can't agree on who or what he actually was. A king who appears for 3 verses in the Bible, performs one act, and then vanishes completely. No birth record, no death, no genealogy, just bread, wine, and a blessing. His name is Melchizedek, and he's been debated by religious scholars for over 2,000 years. Welcome aboard ARNIE'S Brain Train. I'm Alex Arnold, and today we're looking at why all the Judeo-Christian religions want to claim him and what the evidence actually shows. Before we dive in, yes, there are AI images in this video. I'm not paying licensing fees to use someone's photograph of a painting from 1642. If that bothers you, I don't really care. The content is what matters, not the footage in the background. Also, I'm going to discuss religious claims using historical evidence and scholarship, and these are probably going to disagree with things that you've heard in the past. If that makes you feel uncomfortable, good. That means you're learning something. If it makes you angry, there's a back button or an X button. We're all about the facts here. All of my sources are linked below. As always, let's get into it. Let's go. So let's start by asking ourselves, who is Melchizedek? Now, it gets weird right out of the gate. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament describes him like this: without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. So think about that for a second. In a culture that was absolutely obsessed with family lineage, where your genealogy determined everything from your social status to your religious authority, here's a guy with zero backstory. No son of so-and-so, no tribal affiliation, no ancestry. He just exists. And he only appears in the Bible for 3 verses. That's it, just 3. In Genesis 14, Abraham, the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, returns from battle, and this mysterious king named Melchizedek shows up out of nowhere. He's described as a king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He brings out bread and wine, blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives him 1/10 of everything that he has. Then, Melchizedek disappears from the narrative completely. No explanation, no follow-up, just nothing. Now, if you've been watching my videos on biblical archaeology and lost texts, you know this pattern. The Bible references people and books all the time that we know existed, but then gives us almost nothing about them. Melchizedek is one of the most extreme examples. Just for context, this would be like if George Washington met some random guy on a battlefield and that guy blessed him, and then Washington gave him a portion of the spoils, and then nobody ever mentioned who that guy was or where he came from. Except this isn't just any historical figure. This is Abraham. And the text treats this encounter like it's incredibly significant, while simultaneously telling us almost nothing about it. Alright, so now let's take a look at what Genesis chapter 14 actually says. Here's the passage. And Melchizedek king of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And that's it. That's the entire account. But here's what makes this unusual in historical context. Like I mentioned before, in ancient Near Eastern literature, genealogy is everything. When you read ancient texts, they're obsessive about who someone's father was, what tribe they belonged to, and where they came from. The Bible is no exception. You've got entire chapters that are just genealogies, sometimes called the begats, because they're literally lists of who begat who. Yet, here's Melchizedek, performing a priestly function and receiving tithes from Abraham himself, and the text gives us nothing. No father's name, no mother, no birth, no death, no descendants. Some scholars suggest that King of Salem might refer to Jerusalem, Salem possibly being an ancient name for the city. If true, Melchizedek was a Canaanite king priest. Abraham, founder of the Israelite people, is giving tithes to a Canaanite priest. The name itself is revealing. In Hebrew, Melchizedek breaks down to Melchi, king, and Zedek, righteousness or judge. King of righteousness, Salem means peace, the king of righteousness who rules the city of peace. This reads more like a symbolic title than an actual birth name. Now here's where it gets interesting. Melchizedek disappears from the biblical narrative for about 1,000 years. Then he reappears in Psalm 110, attributed to King David. Verse 4 says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Now this creates a huge problem. In Israelite law, you could only be a priest if you were a descendant of Aaron from the tribe of Levi. Non-negotiable. Your genealogy determined your religious authority. Point blank. But here's David from the tribe of Judah, not Levi, receiving a prophecy about a priesthood in the order of Melchizedek, a priesthood outside the normal rules, a priesthood that doesn't depend on ancestry. This becomes crucial in Christian theology and the book of Hebrews. Alright, so now we jump to the book of Hebrews written in the 1st century. This is where things start to get really theological. The author dedicates an entire chapter to Melchizedek and makes some pretty significant claims. Hebrews chapter 7 verses 1 through 3 says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever." Now, the author isn't saying that Melchizedek literally has no parents. Everyone has biological parents. He's saying that the biblical text provides no genealogy. The silence is the point. In ancient Jewish interpretive tradition, what the text doesn't say matters just as much as what it does. The absence of Melchizedek's genealogy isn't an accident. It's deliberately meaningful. The text's silence about his birth and death makes him a perfect symbol for an eternal priesthood. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, this mystery about an unidentifiable king has shaped the theology of billions of people. Understanding Melchizedek explains on a micro scale how Christianity broke from traditional Jewish practices, why certain priesthood claims exist in modern religions, and how ancient writers used literary techniques to make theological arguments. The author of Hebrews uses Melchizedek to argue that Jesus represents a superior priesthood to the Levitical system. Since Melchizedek blessed Abraham and Abraham paid him tithes, that means Melchizedek's priesthood is superior to Abraham's. And since the Levitical priests are descendants of Abraham, that makes Melchizedek's priesthood superior to theirs too. This allowed early Christians to claim that Jesus, who wasn't from the tribe of Levi, could still be a legitimate high priest, not through genealogy, but through a different, more ancient order, the order of Melchizedek. So here's the thing about all this Melchizedek stuff. The debate about Melchizedek's nature didn't start with Christianity. In the 1940s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near Qumran. Among those ancient texts was a fragmentary document called 11Q13, the Melchizedek Scroll. This text, written around 100 BC, presents Melchizedek differently than the Genesis account. In this, he's not just a mysterious priest king, but he's portrayed as a heavenly figure, possibly an archangel, who will come at the end of days to execute divine judgment and proclaim liberty to captives. If you've seen my videos on Gnostic texts and early Christianity, you know that these alternative interpretations of biblical figures were circulating way before the New Testament was ever written. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove it. The text describes him as presiding over a heavenly court, conducting judgment against the forces of darkness, specifically against a figure called Melchizedek, which means king of wickedness, basically the anti-Melchizedek. According to scholar Joseph Fitzmyer's analysis of 11Q13, the Qumran community saw Melchizedek as an exalted angelic being who would bring about the final jubilee and execute God's vengeance. This shows that even in ancient Judaism, there were different interpretations of who Melchizedek was, not just a historical priest king, but potentially a celestial being. The mystery of Melchizedek wasn't invented by Christian writers. Jewish communities were already debating his nature centuries before the book of Hebrews was written. Now, here's what's fascinating, and frankly contradictory, about how many modern Christians, especially Protestants, approach Melchizedek. They hold these beliefs about him being this eternal figure, this type of Christ, this superior priesthood, But these beliefs don't come from those 3 verses in Genesis. They're not in the Bible. They come from extra-biblical sources, apocryphal texts, pseudepigrapha, Jewish traditions that were passed down for centuries. Many of these same groups will reject the Book of Enoch, reject the Testament of Levi, and reject the Jewish Midrashic literature. But they'll happily adopt the theological conclusions that come from those texts. They believe the teachings, but reject the scriptures that teach them. Alright, so given all of this, if Melchizedek was a real historical figure, who was he? Here are the main theories, and they range from pretty straightforward to kinda wild. Theory number 1, a historical Canaanite priest-king. The most straightforward explanation is that Melchizedek was simply a local Canaanite ruler who controlled Jerusalem, Salem, around 2000 to 1800 BC. In the ancient Near East, kings often served as priests, so that dual role wouldn't be unusual. According to research by biblical scholar John A. Emerton in his work on Melchizedek in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, the name Melchizedek follows typical Canaanite naming patterns from that period, and El Elyon, God Most High, was a known Canaanite deity title. This supports the idea of a historical Canaanite priest-king. The reason that we have no genealogy? Well, the Genesis account was written down centuries after the events, and those details were either lost or considered unimportant to the theological point that was being made. Theory number 2, Shem, the son of Noah. Jewish rabbinic tradition, particularly in the Talmud and the Midrashic literature, sometimes identifies Melchizedek with Shem, one of Noah's sons. According to biblical genealogies, Shem would have still been alive during Abraham's time. This theory attempts to give Melchizedek a genealogy by suggesting that he's hiding under a priestly title. It also explains why Abraham would defer to him, honoring his ancestor. Theory number 3, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Some early Christian writers, including figures like Jerome and Ambrose, interpreted Melchizedek as a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. They took the Hebrew's description of being without beginning of days or end of life literally, rather than as a literary device. However, this view was generally rejected by mainstream Christian theology, which tends to interpret Melchizedek as a human figure who foreshadows Christ rather than being Christ himself. The majority Christian position, articulated clearly by Augustine and followed by most denominations, is that Melchizedek was a real historical person who serves as a type of Christ. Theory number 4, an angelic or heavenly being. As we saw with the Dead Sea Scrolls, some ancient Jewish groups believed Melchizedek was an angelic or heavenly figure. Gnostic texts from the Nag Hammadi library also reference Melchizedek as a celestial being. This interpretation treats him as operating outside of normal human categories right from the start. And theory number 5 is that it was simply a literary device. The most academically accepted theory is that Melchizedek functions primarily as a literary device, a character inserted into the narrative to make theological points about legitimate priesthood existing outside the Israelite system. The lack of genealogy isn't a mystery to solve, it's the whole point, deliberately left undefined for symbolic purposes. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Melchizedek didn't stay in the ancient texts. Multiple faith traditions claim connection to his authority, and they absolutely don't agree. This is the same pattern that I've covered in videos on the Council of Nicaea and early Christian debates. Everyone's claiming the same authority, but they're all interpreting it differently to support their own positions. In Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, Melchizedek connects to the Eucharist through the Hebrews text. The bread and wine he brought Abraham prefigures communion. Catholic liturgy includes the Roman canon, which references Melchizedek's sacrifice, asking God to accept offerings, as you were pleased to accept the gifts of your servant Abel the just, the sacrifice of Adam our father, in faith, and the offering of your high priest Melchizedek. They claim his priesthood points directly to Christ and the sacramental priesthood of the Church. Protestants interpret Melchizedek through Hebrews as a type of Christ's eternal priesthood. But here's where they diverge from Catholics. Protestants reject Catholic claims to continuing Melchizedek-style priesthood through apostolic succession. For them, Christ alone holds this priesthood, not earthly priests. Same figure, but totally opposite conclusions about authority. And here's what's interesting about both of these positions. They're extrapolating massive theological systems from 3 verses in Genesis and 1 chapter in Hebrews. They've taken just enough of the Melchizedek tradition to justify their positions on priesthood authority, but they ignore or outright reject the fuller traditions about Melchizedek that exist in Jewish apocryphal texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Pseudepigrapha. It's selective use of ancient tradition to support their modern theology. In Judaism, Melchizedek largely fades into the background after Genesis, though rabbinic literature contains various speculations. He's interesting, but he's not central to Jewish theology or practice. And some traditions suggest that he lost his priesthood entirely due to blessing Abraham before blessing God in Genesis 14. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's a priesthood order called the Melchizedek priesthood, which they consider the higher of 2 priesthood orders held by male members. According to LDS Doctrine and Covenants, it was originally called the Holy Priesthood after the Order of the Son of God, but was renamed to avoid too frequent repetition of God's name. They claim this priesthood authority was lost after the Apostles and restored through Joseph Smith. This puts them in direct conflict with Catholic claims of unbroken apostolic succession and Protestant rejection of earthly priesthood continuation. In Islamic tradition, Melchizedek isn't mentioned in the Quran, but some Islamic commentators have identified him with various prophetic figures, including suggestions that he might be the prophet Khidr, a mysterious righteous servant of God mentioned in Surah 18. While Islam doesn't build theology around Melchizedek like Christianity does, some Muslim scholars claim him as part of the prophetic tradition predating Muhammad. In esoteric and occult traditions, Melchizedek appears in various forms. Gnostic texts portray him as a celestial revealer of hidden knowledge, and some Hermetic and Rosicrucian traditions claim him as an ancient master of mystical wisdom. These groups see all the mainstream religious interpretations as missing the deeper esoteric truth about Melchizedek's cosmic role. So, in the end, everyone wants Melchizedek, and nobody agrees. His mysterious nature makes him a blank slate for different theological needs. Catholics say he validates their priesthood. Protestants say he proves only Christ holds that authority. Mormons say he represents restored priesthood power. Mystery schools say that he holds secret knowledge. They can't all be right, but the lack of clear historical evidence means none of them can definitively prove any of the others wrong. Okay, so let's circle back to the big question we started with. Did Melchizedek actually exist? Well, let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. We have zero archaeological evidence for Melchizedek as a historical figure. No inscriptions, no artifacts, and no independent historical records outside of biblical and related religious texts. What we do have is a textual tradition spanning over 2,000 years that has influenced billions of people. Whether Melchizedek was a real Canaanite king, a literary creation, an angelic being, or something in between, his impact is undeniable. But based on the evidence, the most likely scenario is that Melchizedek represents a historical memory, possibly of a real priest-king of early Jerusalem, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down in Genesis. The details were either lost or deliberately omitted because they weren't relevant to the theological point being made. Or, and this is where it gets interesting, the details were deliberately removed because they challenged the religious establishment of the day. Think about it. His name literally translates to King of Righteousness. He's clearly super important to multiple religious traditions, yet we get 3 verses in Genesis. It's almost as if the biblical editors kept just enough of Melchizedek to rationalize what they needed him for, specifically to provide a theological framework for priesthood authority outside the Levitical system, but they stripped away everything else about him that might have been inconvenient. The author of Genesis wasn't writing a historical biography. He was writing sacred history with theological purposes. Melchizedek's lack of genealogy serves the narrative by showing that legitimate priesthood and relationship with God existed before the Israelite covenant, before the law of Moses and before the Levitical system. Later communities, like the Qumran sect, early Christians, and various Jewish interpreters, saw different potential in that textual silence and built on it in different directions. They weren't necessarily trying to tell us who Melchizedek was. They were trying to use who he represented to make arguments about authority, priesthood, cosmic order, and the nature of divine covenant. Here's something big that often gets missed, though. I mentioned that Jesus himself was descended from the tribe of Judah. He wasn't a Levite. According to the Levitical system, he had no business claiming priestly authority. Yet, he did. And when he challenged the hereditary priesthood of his day, he was showing the Jews that their system was corrupt and was never intended to be the ultimate authority. The Levitical priesthood is consistently described in extra-biblical texts as the lesser priesthood. The Melchizedek priesthood is the higher order. So Jesus wasn't inventing something new, but he was restoring something ancient that predated the corrupted system. But here's the catch. Mainstream Christianity took those 3 verses about Melchizedek, used them to justify breaking from Jewish priesthood authority, and then just stopped. They kept just enough of the Melchizedek tradition to rationalize their split, but rejected the fuller tradition that exists in apocryphal and pseudepigraphal texts that would actually explain much more about this figure and his significance. The Dead Sea Scrolls shows us that even before Christianity, Jewish groups were elevating Melchizedek to cosmic significance. The New Testament uses him to restructure priesthood authority. Medieval Christianity incorporates him into liturgy. Modern religious claims claim connection to his order. Mystery schools see him as a bearer of esoteric wisdom. 3 verses in Genesis. That's all it took to launch 2,000 years of speculation, theology, and religious claims. Okay, now comes the part of the show where I'll try to pull everything all together. We started by asking why every religion fights over Melchizedek. And the answer is that he represents what every religious tradition needs: legitimacy, authority, and a connection to something ancient and divine that predates their competitors' claims. The Catholics point to him to validate sacramental priesthood. Protestants use him to argue against Catholic claims. The Mormons cite him as evidence for restored priesthood authority. Mystery schools see him as proof of esoteric knowledge outside of mainstream religion. Jewish tradition tries to identify him with Shem. Ancient Qumran sectarians elevated him to angelic status, and early Christians made him a type of Christ. Melchizedek is a unique case. He appears before the law, before the Levitical priesthood, and before institutional religion as we know it. He blesses Abraham, the father of monotheism, which means that his authority supersedes the entire Abrahamic tradition. That's why everyone claims him. That's why the debate continues. But here's what often gets overlooked in all of this. The reason Melchizedek matters so much is because he represents the higher priesthood, the one that predates the corrupted Levitical system. Jesus understood this. He was from Judah, not Levi. He had no hereditary claim to the priesthood. Yet, he functioned as a high priest because he was operating under a different, more ancient authority, the order of Melchizedek. This wasn't Jesus inventing something new. This was Jesus pointing back to something that existed before the hereditary system became corrupt. The Levitical priesthood was always meant to be the lesser priesthood. The Melchizedek order was always the higher authority. Extra-biblical texts made this abundantly clear, but mainstream Christianity largely ignores them, even though their entire theology about Melchizedek depends on traditions that come from those texts. Here are the key points. Melchizedek appears in Genesis for 3 verses with no genealogy, which is very unusual for ancient Near Eastern literature. Psalm 110 establishes a Melchizedek priesthood outside the Levitical system. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal ancient Jewish communities saw him as an angelic figure before Christianity. The book of Hebrews uses him to argue for Christ's eternal priesthood. Many Christian beliefs about Melchizedek come from extra-biblical sources that they otherwise reject. The 3 verses were likely kept to rationalize the split from Levitical priesthood authority, while removing other details that challenged orthodoxy. Jesus, from the tribe of Judah, demonstrated that the hereditary Levitical system was corrupt and the Melchizedek priesthood was the higher order. Multiple modern religious traditions claim connection to his authority. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, LDS, Islamic commentators, and esoteric groups. But no archaeological evidence confirms his actual historical existence. His literary and theological function may matter more than his historical reality. So, whether you see Melchizedek as a real king, a literary device, an angel, or a pre-incarnate Christ, or something else entirely, often depends on your theological starting point. This reveals as much about how we interpret ancient texts as it does about ancient history. Well, everybody, that's the last stop for ARNIE'S Brain Train. We just uncovered why every major religion fights over one mysterious figure. From a 3-verse appearance in Genesis to the Dead Sea Scrolls to competing priesthood claims across Catholics, Protestants, Mormons, and mystery traditions, Melchizedek remains the most contested figure in religious literature. All the sources that I referenced are linked in the description or in the pinned comment below. Go verify everything yourself, because that's what this channel is really all about. If you want to see me improve any aspect of these videos, or if there's a topic that you really want me to tackle, let me know in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and help me grow. Every subscription helps me make better productions and dive deeper into these fascinating topics. Hit that like button if this made you think differently about ancient texts or religious claims. I'm Alex Arnold, and remember, the world isn't always this simple, but it's always this interesting. I'll see you on the next stop. All aboard. Bye.